Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. I'm Josh, this is John, and today we are going to be talking about steampunk fantasy. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Dungeon Brew. Today we are continuing our series talking about different types of genres you may explore as a dungeon master or a game master. And today we're going to be talking about steampunk. John, why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about steampunk? What is it? How do we incorporate it?
Sure. So, steampunk is something that I've run a few games in. I actually like steampunk quite a bit. Mostly it is the Victorian era. Is usually what you kind of think of. Sometimes it goes back and forth between the Americas and the US, but a lot of times it is also centralized in the European type era. It is pretty much always pre-World War I. We're talking about times when steam is primarily used as the combustible or the driving force behind all machinery. Which is going to differentiate a little bit with diesel punk, which we're going to do in the next video, which is more of a gasoline fuel type orientation. So we're staying focused on steam. It usually gets very much into like this fantastical element of technology that almost feels more modern than it should, but is still driven by steam in some way. It's an era in which people are idealizing technology. They're thinking about all of the possibilities. They're getting super creative with things that can occur because of the inclusion of this newfound means of driving machinery in a way that hasn't really been seen before.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways I think you can incorporate steampunk into your world, or at least that element. We talked before about how you can mix and match a lot of the different things that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. I usually think of steampunk as being more dystopian in nature. It usually lends well to dark fantasy settings, in my personal opinion, but you can have it fit other realms as well. But it does come out of like the punk genre. So it has this sci-fi feel to it a little bit. They're kind of blending into your fantasy world and bringing it to life for your characters to kind of, again, explore technology in a way that maybe you don't see in more typical fantasy settings.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that steampunk does lend itself well to certain genres. You mentioned dark fantasy. Lovecraftian works really well because Lovecraft falls into that same Victorian era. But it's also something that it really depends on how you choose to have the worldview of technology exist. Like I mentioned initially, is that technology can be seen as this bright future for all of these things that can be done. But the dark fantasy aspect of it enters in when you see the reverse of that, which is something that you see in some of the Fable games. This industrial era type thing where you have a poor class of citizen who are forced to work in industry and it's kind of filthy conditions. They're working 20 hours a day and life is very, very hard for them. On the opposite end, you have the elite classes who have access to the new technology and all of the bright and shiny things that promise a better future for them.
Mm-hmm. So in creating this world, what are some things that you first look to, John, to, I guess, give it that steampunk stamp? I know that I've played a lot of these games with you, so I'm thinking of things like your weapons and that type of thing, and how technology may even be seen in some of the buildings or within the palaces being utilized. But what do you first look at when you start building this world and say, I want to make sure that people know this is what type of adventure they're stepping into?
So for me, interestingly enough, the steampunk aesthetic is something that I enjoy probably more than most other aesthetics for different genres. There's a certain appeal to it for me that I just really, really enjoy. You mentioned things like weapons. That's definitely a thing. So I incorporate firearms pretty much all the time. I make sure that they remain relatively simplistic. I don't want to end up with these multi-fire weapons and things like that. They're not machine guns. We're not to World War I yet. We're like single-shot rifles and things like that. It depends on where on that technology scale you want to land, but that's one of the things. So oftentimes, for instance, when you guys entered into one of the steampunk cities that I had created the guards were called peace officers. They walked up and down the streets. They had the button, like the double-breasted coats that they walked along with. They had batons and pistols. They didn't carry swords around with them because that wasn't something that you used. It was like they had a billy club type situation. They had the fancy little hats and that type of stuff. The buildings themselves would have been reminiscent of the Victorian era rather than more medieval. So any medieval structures that are crafted out of stone or something are very old, and they're being replaced by other things. You're getting rid of thatch roofs. You're getting tile roofs instead. You're also getting more of the sense of science and technology as being a driving factor behind the way that the world works. So you're going to have things like steamships and trains and that type of thing being incorporated into the world versus the horse and buggy and that type of stuff as being the driving force. Those things are being pushed out. Medicine is important. Technology is important. You no longer pay attention quite as much to the crazy herbalist or somebody like that because that's no longer science. They're relying on chemicals now and not nature in order to accomplish the things that they want to accomplish.
Yeah, I was going to mention medicine specifically in terms of the new elements and the new chemicals that are being put into the air and the new diseases that you might have coming as a subsequent consequence of exploring those technologies and how it's impacting the populations. I know one of the settings we played with you had the plague that was going on, and so you had doctors that were seeking cures that were more medicinal in nature instead of maybe going out to find a witch doctor or a sorcerer or somebody that might be able to deal with it in that means. Magic kind of takes a step down in terms of its importance many times.
Right.
Not to say that you can't have a magic imbued, fantasy world with steampunk, but usually with the rise of technology, you see the interest in magic becoming less and less among the civilized people.
Right, and in that setting in particular, I drove more towards a low magic type system where the people who were using magic were seen as being witches or evil or some kind of terrible thing. They're aligned with the devil or the demons or something along those lines. Magic was bad, technology was good, except for when you entered into regions in which the opposite was true, particularly for those regions where technology was having a negative effect on the populace, in which case they were still relying on magic in some way. We were also utilizing other cultures such as dwarves or elves and that type of thing where you could see some of those dynamics in play. The dwarves were a magical race who were exploring technology and could do things with technology that other people couldn't do, whereas the elves had no interest at all whatsoever in technology, and their entire civilization was going into ruin because they were still relying basically on this old magic and nature and all this other stuff, which was losing its authority and losing its power in the world overall.
I think one of the things that I like most about steampunk, which I know we're going to talk about diesel punk later, but steampunk specifically to me almost feels like the dawning of technology, and so there's still some elements of medieval style gameplay within that world. You mentioned how your peace officers, for instance, carried around batons instead of swords, but it doesn't mean that individuals within civilization aren't carrying swords. Yes. They don't still have those ancient types of weaponry that are with them as they're moving throughout. So warfare looks very interesting within the setting as some people are moving on to using, guns, buckshot, shotguns, whatever that they're utilizing. And you still have knights in armor with swords that are riding in the battle that aren't necessarily equipped to fight against that type of weaponry.
Yeah, that's definitely an aesthetic or a technology or a fantasy. Like that's a decision that has to be made on the part of the GM when they're going into the world building. It could be a situation where you want to stay more realistic, where the idea of knights in armor battling with people with guns is just ridiculous, and that doesn't enter into it. For myself, I enjoy it the same way that you do, where it's like a mashing of those aesthetics into one world. It can be very entertaining to watch. You can have the gentleman walking down the street who is part of the same adventuring party, who has his cassock, and he has a sword cane where sometimes he pulls the sword out of his cane, and he's got a pistol on his hip, and he goes adventuring in that way. And then you can also have the half-ogre barbarian who is traveling along with them that has basically a giant log with a couple of iron spikes driven through it as being part of that same adventuring party. I like that mismatch and that aesthetic of imagining that group traveling together to accomplish deeds. And I think it's fun.
I think it is too. I think the challenge here, because we want to specifically talk about, your DMs or your GMs that are running this campaign, is creating scenarios or situations or encounters for your party that may be mixed matched, so that all of them have a tool or a weapon or something that does the job to get the mission accomplished without always having to rely on your gnome that's carrying the dual pistols at their belt. You might need to have that half ogre with his club to get through a certain obstacle, and if it weren't for him, you wouldn't have been able to overcome that.
Right. So I think something else, there's two other things that I want to touch on. One is just talking about mechanics a little bit, and the other one is talking about some fonts of inspiration that I like to use for steampunk. But as far as mechanics go, I think that there's a couple of things to consider if you're incorporating things like guns or firearms in some way. There are rules for this in the DMG if you're running 5th edition, which are fairly basic. You can incorporate other rules for loading weapons because these are a little bit more complicated to load. It takes time to do. And you could also incorporate guns that have maybe multiple barrels. So this was, pretty common with something like a shotgun where you have more than one barrel to load and there's more than one trigger, one trigger for one barrel, one trigger for the other one, which allows them to have more than one barrel loaded, but you might do something where it's a long load weapon and it takes them longer to load that weapon, but they'll have 2 shots. And potentially could pull both triggers at once if they want to do additional damage or really, let out a blast of power with a weapon like that. And for myself, I also created guns that had multiple triggers or multiple barrels, up to I think 5 or 6 barrels at a time, with consequences that were used if there was a misfire or something like that. So I did a lot of mechanically with the guns to try and balance those, which I found interesting, and it's something to consider when you're creating a world like this, to consider how the impact of something like a gun is going to change gameplay, while making it interesting for the players to engage in, but not making it so overpowered that it is the default option and nobody feels comfortable still picking that ogre with a club in its hand or something. So I'm trying to think, Josh, if there are any other mechanic things that you remember that I was using at that time for steampunk in particular, or any advice that you have particular for mechanics.
Not off the top of my head. I know that you usually manage the mechanic pieces a little bit more. So no. I was trying to think of other things that we've done that have worked, and I know there's a lot of things that you might find in a particular player's guide or even within DMG that kind of go by the wayside when you start stepping into this realm. Just because it's certain tools and stuff that aren't utilized as much. Yeah. And we talked about this in terms of old school D&D. It's just things that you might find your characters deciding they no longer want to utilize because technology is going to replace some of those more, not even medieval, but just tools of antiquity that are utilized throughout the course of gameplay. Like flour on the floor, that you're not going to need to find a trap, or you may not be using cow traps. It's things like that you might just not utilize as often.
Well, and you can also incorporate things like, makeshift grenades or Molotovs and that type of thing. Like those will fall into this era pretty easily. You can also use tools in other ways, such as tinker tools, and those can be used to modify or fix guns. You could also use the same thing for blacksmithing supplies if you're wanting to craft new weapons or find interesting things in that way. There is a tendency, if you want to get into the far fantasy stuff, to start combining weird things. So one of the guns that I had, for instance, was a saw blade gun. So it was a gun that fired saw blades at people. So that type of thing, just if you really want to get creative with the type of weaponry that you could see in this type of environment.
So in terms of inspiration, like the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is the first thing that comes to mind because that
Sure.
really fits well into that. I know there's also, some, I want to say it's Disney that made Treasure Island that kind of fits within that same realm as well, which is a replay of, or Treasure Planet. It's a replay of Treasure Island. So there are some things like that. But what inspiration do you typically look to build these types of worlds or try to mirror?
Two big ones for me. One is the game Arcanum. It came out in the early 2000s, I think like right around 2000, 2001, something like that. It is a CRPG that is set into a steampunk world where there are air blimps flying around, and you have basically the option of that aesthetic we were talking about. You could be a traditional knight in armor with weapons. You could be a pure technologist where you are running around with guns, or you could be a wizard of some kind and you would still have access to magic in some way. It was a very fascinating game. It's still playable and purchasable, which is awesome because sometimes those old games start to disappear, but it is one of my all-time favorites when you're talking about a steampunk aesthetic. When I was crafting a couple of these steampunk worlds that I was working on, I also listened to the Dolls of New Albion pretty much on repeat the entire way. It's a steampunk opera that is done by... Shapira, I think is his name. But it's also something that's available. It used to be available on YouTube, but I think that now you actually have to go and get the CD or something like that. But it's a very, very good just music and that type of thing that offers a lot of inspiration in that regard.
Yeah, I actually really like listening to, this sounds probably kind of silly, but I really like listening to dark Western music.
Right.
Dark Western fantasy music when I'm thinking about this area or I'm building worlds that are around this or even writing stories that are within this genre. There's just something about that feel of it that makes it, I don't know, it captures that dark fantasy steampunk feel for me when I'm writing.
Right, and that's something we didn't touch on a whole lot. I feel like we focused a little bit more on the Victorian era, but the Western steampunk is definitely... something that you can build into as well. It is a style and a system that is supported that you can find, all over the place. And the idea of cowboys, especially because you're talking about steam trains going into the West, you're talking about cowboys with their guns, and really the steampunk aspect of it that you can choose to include is something like magic, like bringing that and folding it into the world in some way, which you aren't necessarily obligated to do. Steampunk can be a magic. It could be without magic whatsoever if you really wanted it to be. It's really a choice on the part of the GM when it comes to world building at that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. We'd love to know what you've done in Steampunk Adventures. What's been your favorite? What have you explored that maybe we didn't touch on in this video? Please hit the subscribe button, and we will see you guys next week when we talk about Dieselpunk.
Dungeon Brew.